Welcome to the Understanding Daniel podcast. My name is Peter Englert, and I've got two friends here. Let me introduce our guests first. We have the guest today, Ron Pierce. He is a professor emeritus from Biola University. He actually wrote the commentary on Daniel, the Teach the Text, and we're very excited to have him. But then also, I have my very good friend, co-host, Rich Christman here. Rich, how you doing?
Hi, Ron. Hi, Peter. So excited to be on a show with you. It's been a while, maybe 2 years since I've been on a show with Peter. So excited to be back here. And good to meet you, Ron.
Good to meet you as well.
Well, we're going to get started. Our question today is, how does Daniel give us hope for the end of the world, for end times? And, Ron, why don't we start here? Because we're going to take a unique path to respond to that question. How did you get so intrigued with the book of Daniel?
Yeah, of course, I went through the Sunday school stories as a kid. And so I always had the Daniel in the lion's den and the friends in the furnace. But I was an Old Testament major at Talbot. And as such, I needed to take Aramaic. And as such, we ended up in a Daniel class. So I kind of got started there, and with Talbot, it's more systematic theology. So a lot of interest in end times and schemes of end times. But then in my doctoral program, I started focusing more on what we call biblical theology. And in that context, my focus went from sort of the end times as we think of them today to the place where Daniel was. So I began to think of the book more in his terms, look at it in his eyes. And so I started teaching it. And in the context, I discovered the incredible literary beauty of the book, the structure, the way the languages are arranged, Aramaic and Hebrew, the chiastic structures, the way the dates are arranged. So Daniel puts this together. Some days I think he had too much time right at the end of his life, because it's so beautifully constructed. And then the real surprise for me was the spiritual formation component. I was doing a series of spiritual formation studies toward the end of my career, about the last 10 years. And in that context, I began to discover things in Daniel that I never saw coming. So a long time, Daniel and I, a long time in the same direction.
That's so cool. Could you just actually, for our listeners that may have different levels of, background in theology, could you just explain really quick the difference between a systematic theology and a biblical theology?
Sure. Yeah. Systematic theology is probably the more common, where we take pieces of scripture from here and there, try to put them together in a grand scheme of what's going to happen at the end times, for example, in what we call eschatology. Biblical theology, or sometimes it's called canonical theology, looks back at the text in its own context. So rather than thinking, what's going to happen in the 21st century, we're thinking, what was Daniel experiencing in the 6th century BC? And so when we look at prophecy in the book of Daniel, we're thinking 6th century BC. We're looking at it through his eyes. And that's what I really found intriguing.
That's fascinating. That's so interesting.
So let me, I want to take a little bit of a left turn here, because just you shared your story about going through the Aramaic. So there is a little bit of discussion about the importance, the oddness of Daniel 7 through 12 being in Aramaic. Why was it put in the Bible? What's its level of importance versus the Hebrew and the Greek? And there's a lot of discussion around that. You've been teaching Daniel, I don't know, for a few years now. How do you respond to that, especially since that was part of your first just really study in Talbot?
Yeah, the Hebrew and Aramaic mix in the book of Daniel is interesting because the first 6 chapters are narrative and we're most familiar with them. The last 6 chapters are more apocalyptic with strange visions and symbols. The Aramaic actually bridges the two and pulls the two together. So Daniel didn't allow the book to get disconnected in any way as he was structuring it. So if you pull it out here, then you lose the last half of the Aramaic. If you pull this piece off here, even with the narratives, if you go 1 through 6 and 7 through 12, So I think it's there to keep it together. I also think it reflects the context, because the people who were first reading this book were speaking Aramaic, not Hebrew. They had lost their ability to speak Hebrew in the exile, and they had spoken the more common trade language of Aramaic. So the book now takes on a little bit of international flavor or cross-cultural flavor instead of just this purely Jewish flavor. And I can imagine the early readers of Daniel are thinking, why did he put some of it in Aramaic? If we can't read Hebrew, then it's not going to help to only have some of it in Aramaic. We did the whole thing in Aramaic, but he doesn't. He puts it partly Aramaic, partly Hebrew, and it doesn't really fit neatly into either one of the structures. So it's part of the glue that holds the book together. And I think part of just the literary beauty of the book.
Is there any significance at all in the fact, is Aramaic a more poetic language in any way than Hebrew? Is there any connection there to the way that Aramaic reads or what it sounds like when read aloud?
No, not at all. If you didn't know the grammar, you would almost think, when I say grammar, I'm including the way words are formed, word endings. If you didn't know that, it looks just like Hebrew. And it sounds just like Hebrew. It's just maybe you put the definite article at the end of the word instead of the beginning of the word. But it's just those kind of differences. And the words sound a little bit differently. And then there are some words that develop in Aramaic that weren't in Hebrew. But 90% of overlap,
Well, let's take a turn to kind of your unique perspective on this passage. One of the things that you teach on, and it kind of you've noticed as you've read through Daniel hundreds and even probably thousands of times, is his dark night of the soul. And I want to read you a quote from St. John of the Cross where we got that from. And after I read this quote, I just want to hear from you maybe what stands out to you of what relates to Daniel here. So St. John says this, God, he takes us into the dark night. He weans us from all the pleasures by giving us dry times and inward darkness. In doing so, he's able to take away all these vices and create virtues within us. Through the dark night, pride becomes humility, greed becomes simplicity, wrath becomes contentment, luxury becomes peace, gluttony becomes moderation, envy becomes joy, and sloth becomes strength. No soul will ever grow deep in the spiritual life unless God works passively in that soul by means of the dark night.
Wow. Oh, there's so much there to unpack. What strikes me, first of all, is the way we have tended to treat Daniel as a Sunday school story. And I appreciate that. The early Sunday school stories and Veggie Tales and the images of Daniel and his friends and this kind of thing. But I think we lose in doing that. We lose the depth of character that Daniel exhibits in the book. And we lose the path that he took to get there. So he comes, he's 14 years old, roughly, when he's taken into captivity. At the end of the book, he's 84 years old. So we track him for 70 years. Most people don't realize when he was in the lion's den, he was 80, not 20 or 30, as most of the pictures put it. And in that context, he was torn away from everything. Which was, I think, the beginning of his dark night. I think there were questions in Daniel's mind. Where is God in all of this? How can God let this happen to Judah and Jerusalem. And it was just starting, and then Daniel watches it get worse and worse with the second and third deportation until the temple's destroyed. And I can only imagine how much he struggled and questioned as that night just kept getting darker and darker. But I think John of the Cross is right. I think there is a purification that takes place in the what Eugene Peterson has called sometimes that long obedience in the same direction. And I always think of Daniel when I read Eugene Peterson's book on that, although he connects it with Jeremiah. But I think of Daniel because here he is. Probably when he was in his 20s, his friends were taken out of the palace. That's when the fiery furnace story takes place. And then they're reassigned out among the people. So here's Daniel in his 20s, let's say, alone in the palace for the rest of his life. And that's where I think God works with him in that deep sense of spiritual formation from the inside out in a sort of furnace of his own, but a darkness being the furnace. Yeah. I could go on with that. There's more intrigue in my mind right now about Daniel and his dark night than there are answers. But I think that's part of what the dark night is. It is a place we go to know God more deeply than we ever could have known God in some other way. Yeah.
Before we kind of jump more in the text about that, at the time that we're recording this, there's been a lot of tragedy. There was the Charlie Kirk assassination, the 24th year of September 11th, the anniversary. Obviously, every listener probably has perspectives and views on that. As we think of maybe even nihilism or cynicism, what about Daniel 7 through 12 should we be really honing in on, especially at this time when it just seems like everything else is out of control?
Yeah, and I think the last phrase that you used there is exactly where we began. I'm thinking of our friend Tremper Longman from Westmont, who constantly in his work repeats this: God is in control. God is in control. And I think Daniel had to kind of repeat that in his own head because he had lost so much. And then even being in Babylon, it's okay, you're going to go to Babylon, you're going to be there 70 years. But then different nations arise, not just one kingdom, but several kingdoms. And then at the end of the Babylonian Empire, they don't get to go back right away. And Daniel's upset about this. So world events, from his perspective, great world events, are all turned upside down. What he knew to be true as being part of God's people in Jerusalem, a very bright Jewish boy living in Jerusalem, probably grew up listening to Jeremiah the prophet. And so he had heard what was coming, but it doesn't matter if we hear it. It's when we finally experience it, it's just, it's traumatic in the greatest sense of the word. So when I come to Daniel 12, that's where I go. Matter of fact, I often go to contemporary world events. In teaching it over the years, we've had a lot of those moments, including 9/11. When it first took place, I was teaching a class on Daniel. And people are thinking the world's collapsing around us. And I'm saying that's exactly what Daniel thought. My world is collapsing around me. And I don't know where the future's going. And then, and I know we're just beginning to touch on this, but in chapters 7 through 12, there's a lot more darkness than there was in chapters 1 through 6. Especially for Daniel. Here's a guy that he used to be able to interpret the dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, for example, for the king, as a young kid. So 14 years old, he's interpreting the king's dreams. But when we get to chapters 7 and 8, Daniel can't even interpret his own dreams. And they're dark and foreboding. And I don't think it's just because there's ugly beasts coming up out of the water and all this kind of thing. I think it's because he sees the suffering of his people coming in the distant future. And he's thinking, hey, didn't we already have that? Isn't that going to be over by then? And there is this 3.5 year number that pops up where this great suffering is going to take place of God's people. We stand back and say, oh, 3.5 years. I wonder how that fits in this number and that number. We get all our prophecy charts out. We have this great time. For Daniel, he only had one thing on his mind. My people are going to suffer intensely like that. I thought we were going to be done with it by then. And then we're just going to get to go home and things are going to get better. Kingdom of God is coming. And the angel says, no, there is something foreboding coming in the future. And I think that's part of Daniel's dark night. I mean, he doesn't understand why. He's confused, frustrated, and sometimes I think Daniel was pretty upset.
Before we move on, because, I'm looking at some of your outlines here, I think it might be really helpful because I love what you said. We know Daniel 1-6 fairly well. We know that Daniel 1, there's the diet, the Daniel diet, and then we get to Daniel 6, and that's the Daniel in the lion's den. You touched on a few things, but just kind of in a systematic, big picture way, what in each chapter is kind of what Daniel's talking about with the end of the age? Just kind of giving us a brief snapshot from each chapter. I think that'd be helpful for our listeners.
Sure. In 1-6, we move from Daniel the teenager to Daniel the 80-year-old in the lion's den. But when we get to 7, we back up. And we're back now, instead of him being 80, we're back to when he was 60, maybe even his mid-50s. And so it's that point where the kingdoms are changing, where new kings coming in, instead of his old friend, sometimes foe, Nebuchadnezzar, we have new kings coming in. And Daniel, he not only sees this foreboding future, he seems to lose his own privilege. He's not the favorite boy in the palace anymore. And especially as we get into if we back up a little bit, chapter 5, into the Belshazzar moment, Daniel's somewhere in the back room and the queen mother has to come out and say, hey, you should call Daniel. Belshazzar doesn't care about Daniel anymore. So with chapter 7 and 8, we back up to the beginning of Belshazzar's reign. And Daniel coming into a period where his own importance seems to be waning and the future becomes very dark. So chapter 7 and 8 just form a pair by themselves. Chapter 7's far more mysterious, a lot of images, wild beasts, this kind of thing. Chapter 8, we actually have names put to some of the kingdoms. So we know we have Babylon, and then we know we have the Median Empire, the Medes up north, and then the Persians, which are kind of down south, modern day Iran. And then we have the Greeks coming. These are the named kingdoms that we have for Daniel. And he would have understood them, especially at later time in his life. He would have heard of Greece having sort of developing over there in the West. But the others are more Eastern empires, Middle Eastern empires. So then we jump ahead in time to chapter 9, which is the end of the exile. It's the last year, and he opens the chapter by reading in Jeremiah. And so he's thinking, yeah, Jeremiah said 70 years, click, click, check my watch, it's 70 years, time to go home. And so, dear Lord, time to go home. He has this long, lengthy prayer. And then the angel comes and says, well, it's not just 70, but it's like 70 times 7. It's like Jesus saying to Peter, you have to forgive way more than you thought you were going to have to forgive. Only this case, it seems that this suffering is going to go much longer than Daniel thought it was going to go. And so that's where we jump in and we want to figure out the numbers and when everything's happening regarding the end times. But Daniel, he's sitting there thinking, no, we've paid the price. time for our people to go home. What do you mean it's 7 times longer than we thought it was going to be? And then for perspective, 10 through 12 is like one big unit. And it's right at the end of Daniel's life. So now he's 84. Right at the end of his life, he has another vision. And this vision, a long one and very detailed kind of thing, without names, but a lot of detail, of different empires coming and going. And again, I think it's the Medes, and then the Persians, Cyrus the Great, the Persians, and then the Greeks coming. And we know for sure that the Greeks are in there. We can pinpoint Alexander the Great and all this. But then we get to the end of it, and once again, it just fades into darkness. And Daniel, he's still trying to figure things out until an angel finally shows up and says, Daniel, you can close the book now. It's over. It's like a person on their deathbed, and somebody finally comes in and says, it's okay to let go now. And I think that's what the angel's saying to Daniel. He's still arguing with God. What about this time of suffering? What's this so many days of suffering that we have? No, just let go of it. And here we have that remarkable way the book ends with an image of resurrection. That is so rare in the Old Testament. But Daniel, you can die in peace because a resurrection is coming. And the book's over. It's like, whoa. So I just love walking through Daniel like that, because it takes me back through all of that incredible drama and I think trauma that Daniel goes through. Yeah.
It's like the end of an Avengers movie.
Exactly.
The Messiah will return. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Absolutely.
I have a question for
only
you.
With Daniel, he's feeling a little bit more of the darkness hanging over. That's the challenging kind of foreboding thing for Daniel. He has to go back to those moments when he saw hope coming.
Yeah. So I have heard said, which is not a direct quote from the Bible by any means, I've heard it said many times that God is a God of clarity, right? And I've also heard that our Lord works in mysterious ways, right? God is far beyond human reckoning, right? So considering all you just said, I'm not asking you to pick a side here. I'm saying, would you comment a little bit on someone who has the question, well, is God, as God presents himself and his plans in Scripture, is God presenting himself clearly? Should we, read the text exactly as it says, or is God inviting us into a mystery that we can't understand in this time? What would you say to that?
I want to say yes, absolutely. No, I think it's what we understand as clarity. We're looking for details. And Daniel was at the end too. It was like 1,150 days, 1,335 days. Daniel says, tell me about the 1,150. And God just says, no. Don't worry about that. There's resurrection coming. There's the big picture. And Daniel was fussing over the details. But I think he was fussing over the details because they represented suffering. So if you say you're going to suffer for a week or a month, you go, could you clarify that a little, please?
Yeah,
that's a
little different. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think we read it, I would say we read it literally, and understand that in a literal read. In other words, take it as it is. But understand we're going to use figures of speech. So we're going to use symbols of beasts coming up out of the water, to represent kingdoms changing, and images like that. But the key, I think, in Daniel 7 through 12 is you root yourself in the person of Daniel by doing 1 through 6, and even 7 and 8 a little bit, you still see a little, but 1 through 6, you root yourself in that person. And then when you read 7 through 12, you read it through his eyes. So you're not asking questions, for example, about 9/11. You're not asking questions about Russia. You're asking questions about Babylon to Greece. And then you're saying, okay, God, what are you teaching me through those historical times of great suffering for just the Jewish people, so just the southern kingdom? And what happened to the other 10 tribes out there instead of just the southern kingdom? But you've narrowed it down to the remnant, and now the remnant's going to suffer. So, and that's just very literal from Daniel. So, yeah, I think we should read it literally, but I think we need to get to know the person of Daniel in his own context in the 6th century BC and feel the loss. And then we can take principles from that and apply it. And we just go down the line and pick the century. It still applies very much, not just because of the Dark Night, but because we face world events. Now, Daniel wasn't facing an event with China. So he was facing his world of events, which was just the Middle East. America wasn't in the picture at all. Russia wasn't in the picture. I would tell my students, don't drag those nations into the picture of Daniel. He's talking about 4 major kingdoms, maybe Rome in the picture. That's a big debate among evangelicals, and it's not important for me to solve that debate. But mostly it's Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. And it's during the time of the Greeks that there's a great amount of suffering that Daniel looks forward to. And then after the suffering, God's kingdom comes. And after the Greek comes the person of Jesus, right at the very beginning of the Roman Empire. But so I see messianic hope in there. But for Daniel, it's just rather faint. He didn't see clarity on that one at all.
But that's so interesting, too, because you say that, Daniel looks at his watch, like you said, right? Oh, it's been 70 years, time to go home. And, it's actually 70 times 7, the feeling there. Then we look at these literal kingdoms setting up, perhaps making it to the time of Rome. Then the kingdom of heaven will be at hand, and Jesus comes, and the Jews at his time are like, great, I'm looking at my watch, click, click, the kingdom of heaven is here. He's going to overthrow Rome. He's going to establish the kingdom. And still, it's my kingdom is here, but not yet. And that's so interesting.
And not of this world.
Yeah.
There is a already and not yet that both have to hold on to. And we as evangelicals sometimes try to separate those. The one group's arguing for the here and now, and the other's arguing for the then and there. And I don't think we need to. Yeah. I think we can understand the mystery, that there's a very clear sense in the ministry of Jesus that the kingdom of God is here. If I am doing these kind of miracles, then the kingdom of God is among you. And yet the kingdom's still coming. So the great fulfillment of it. But I come from a tradition where there's way too much emphasis on then and there, what we call a dispensational tradition, where it's all about the then and there and literal interpretations and this kind of thing. And I think we need the corrective that our more covenantal brothers and sisters bring us by saying, no, there's a very real sense that it's here and now.
Yeah. Hey, Pete, cancel that Left Behind Bible study we're going to do. Yeah, cancel that. Yeah.
This is why we bring Rich on. He's more funny than I am. I have so many directions I want to head, but I do want to take a little bit of a turn just from listening to you. What do you think Daniel has to say about aging? And you've been studying Daniel, for decades. And you just talked about the book, how it follows him through the decades. As you reflect personally, but then for people reading it, what does Daniel do for us when it comes to aging?
Oh, I like that question very much. And you've been very polite not to say, and you've really gotten old during your time of studying Daniel. But I have. I mean, I turned 79 next month. So I'm clicking 80 and I'm thinking, is there a lion's den waiting for me? Because I've never envisioned Daniel as the old man in the lion's den until I saw the beautiful painting by Breton Riviere called Daniel's Answer to the King. You've got to look it up. The original is still hanging over in Europe. Breton Riviere, French artist, Daniel's Answer to the King. And he has Daniel, the 80-year-old man. It's the best picture I've ever seen of this. So, yeah, I think Daniel, I'll speak for myself here as the soon-to-be 80-year-old man. Daniel tells me that God isn't finished with me yet. That perhaps some of the most important times in my life and ministry may be lying tomorrow or in the future or in the next 5 years. Or in the next 5 years if I'm counting Daniel at 84. There we go. I'll just be Daniel there for a moment. But I also look back, we talked about the dark night. I look back at the dark nights that I've experienced along the way while studying Daniel. And I've had some really dark nights in my life. Another day, another story. But in those contexts, well, let me put it this way. When I started my spiritual formation training 10 years ago, 2015, I came back to one of my friends at Biola who taught spiritual formation, Betsy Barber. And I said to Betsy, she asked me how it was going. And I said, oh, this is incredible. I'm discovering things I never thought I'd discover at this point in my life. And I said, I only wish I would have learned this 30 years earlier. And Betsy looked at me and she said, you weren't ready for this 30 years earlier. And I've really had to think about that a long, slow process of preparation. And now, not in spite of it, but because of all that you've gone through, all that God's done in your life, now you're ready for this thing that God has prepared for you from before you ever were born. That's exciting to me. Right up until the end, that's exciting to me.
I mean, just to get personal, somebody was engaging me about dreams, and I just was thinking about, like, in Daniel, dreams are used to share wisdom. Like, and I think about my own journey. There's this American dream. I had probably the American pastor's dream, and some of that is happening, some of it isn't. But, to go back through the dark night, like, the pride becomes humility and all these things. And I'm thinking about Daniel's life. And when you talked about him, even in his midlife, feeling alone, and if I'm not near where he was age-wise to Belshazzar, but, it's almost as if the Bible doesn't want to necessarily teach you, but it wants to acknowledge reality. And not that those two things are different, because it could say, hey, you're going to get to your midlife and have a crisis. But no, it says, Daniel wasn't, he wasn't Belshazzar's favorite. He was behind the scenes. And I think in some ways that's what's powerful about narrative, is that, like what you're talking about, hey, I'm almost 80. Am I going to have a lion's den type moment versus like, you're like, and like, I think even what you're doing for the first and the second part is, I think we read the Bible without forgetting that the Bible actually reads us.
Oh, yeah. That's an intriguing thought, that the text is kind of reading us as we go along. I'd like to think the Spirit of God is doing exactly that through the Word of God, and guiding us in our reading so that we have these aha moments, when perhaps, staying on the aging theme, when we thought we were too old for any more new aha moments. That, I just retired a year and a half ago from 48 years of teaching. Like I was going to try to make 50, but I decided not. And my wife, Pat, kind of looked at me and said, wow, we can go travel now. What are we going to do with all this free time? And I hear it all the time. What are you doing with all your free time? And I have to smile a little bit and say, I've got so much I want to do yet, that I just changed jobs. I just don't get a paycheck anymore from the old job. I'm not teaching students in classes anymore, but I'm kind of excited as to what God has for the future. And I wonder if Daniel thought about that, especially since he was in his latter years when the exile ended. Yeah. Do I get to go home? Am I too old to go home? We don't know if he ever did go back or not. Probably not. Probably died in exile. But I wonder what he was thinking at that point. I wonder if his friends ever came back to talk to him in the palace. I think Peter, in our previous discussion, I might have mentioned my thought about a historical novel on Daniel. And if I do, I'm going to have Azariah be the writer of the story of Daniel. Have him come back right at the end, see Daniel on his deathbed, stay with him through those last months, and then he puts it all together into the book. Yeah.
For our listeners, why don't you tell them who Azariah is?
Oh, yeah, sorry. We know the boys as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sadly, those are their pagan names that honor pagan gods. But because we just heard the story from chapter 3 and didn't pay a lot of attention to chapter 1, we don't know their Hebrew names. So it's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So Azariah is the third in the list. And Jewish tradition has it that Azariah is the one who sort of led the great prayer in the furnace. There's even a deuterocanonical, an extra biblical document that was created, the prayer of Azariah and the song of the three young men. It's a beautiful, poetically structured document that kind of supplements chapter 3 in the book of Daniel. It's not part of the Bible, but I always have my students read it so they can kind of step into the shoes of Azariah and his two friends in the furnace. And it also challenges them to get away from just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Although, yeah, we are so connected to those names, I don't have any real hope that we're gonna move forward. But I try, yeah.
It's so funny that we know the boys by their Babylonian names, but then we know Daniel as Daniel, not Belteshazzar. It's just funny how he gets that treatment. But since you brought up apocryphal works, I gotta ask, what are your thoughts on Bel and the Dragon? There's the extra chapter that some Christian traditions have at the end of Daniel, but not in the typical evangelical NIV Bible. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the Prayer of Azariah, the Song of Three Young Men, and Bel and the Dragon are the two additions to Daniel that were done in the Greek era. And so Bel and the Dragon, I don't find it as helpful. It's almost humorous. I mean, if you can have humor in the context of Daniel and Cyrus and the lion's den and all this, but I think it's laid out in kind of a almost satire format. I find them very useful, and for part of some Christian traditions, they keep them connected with the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books. I don't see them as what the Protestant church sort of viewed and agreed upon was the canon so I'm not as Catholic maybe as I might be in that context. But I think they're really worthwhile reading and studying, especially the Prayer of Azariah's beautiful Hebrew poetry prayer, like the Psalms, and put in the context of suffering. And for them, for his three friends, almost certain death. I would even say, and I know we're kind of getting off a little bit here, but I would even say in the way they talked to Nebuchadnezzar in that chapter, they had really serious doubts. I think they were pretty sure they were going to die in the furnace, but they decided God is worth dying for. So we're going to just die out of faithfulness. And then the great surprise came when God sent the angel. That's the language of the text. And I know there's a lot of discussion about a messianic interpretation of the angel being Jesus. So setting that aside, God delivers them miraculously and brings them out. I think they were as stunned as anybody, probably as stunned as Nebuchadnezzar was that day.
So as we come to a close, I think what I want to do with the last question, I hope that people, as they've listened to you talk about the book of Daniel, but specifically Daniel 7 through 12, it's so applicable to everyday life, whether we're walking through crisis, dark night of the soul. I had no idea we were going to talk about aging. But with the closing question with this is whether I'm reading the book of Daniel as an individual or whether I'm reading it with my small group, going through it as a church series, what would you want people to experience and feel as they read Daniel 7 through 12?
Yeah. Let me tie that together, if I may, with the other question that was there. What would Daniel say to us today? Because I think Daniel would have loved to have had us experience something, and I think that's probably pretty close to what God would want us to experience. So I think Daniel would say, I've been there. I know your fears. I know your doubts. Instead of putting me on a pedestal, walk beside me. And so then what do I take away from that then? And Daniel, I see honesty before God with Daniel. I think we have put him on a pedestal. And to a degree that we can't really relate to him. I think Daniel is honest with God. I think at the end of the day, he remembers that God is in control. I'm going to come back to Tremper's Longman, the line there that he keeps repeating. He remembers God is in control, but that doesn't simply make him, how do we say in the little Christian song, happy every day. Daniel's not happy every day. Some days are terribly dark and depressing, and in some days he's arguing with God and wrestling with God. But at the end, he ends up trusting in God's goodness and God's grace through the darkness and despair that he so deeply experienced, recognized across this long life of his. And by the end of the time, I can imagine Daniel saying by the end of the time, did I accomplish anything in the process except interpret a few dreams? I wonder if Daniel ever had a clue of what his memoir was going to mean to people down through the ages. But yeah, I think we can trust God through the dark, difficult times and honestly wrestle with God when we are saying, God, I don't like the way you're doing it. I really wish it were done differently. I wish you would not have that suffering ahead for us. And then we can say, okay, but I'll trust you.
Well, just want to encourage you all again, make sure you check out Ron Pierce, Teach the Text. And, we're hoping by the end of this podcast, it's just going to inspire you to write the book on Daniel, Dark Night of the Soul, and then the biography about Daniel. So, hey, we're going to put you to work in rock.
I want to read that novel.
We're going to put you to work.
I need to get started on it.
We're going to put you to work in retirement. Hey, if people were looking for you, where's the best place to find you online?
I'm in the process of constructing a website. So, but you can simply go to Biola University's website, and then you pick up the faculty page in Biola, and just ron.pierce@biola.edu. And so as faculty emeritus, I still connect with Biola and can easily be reached through that. And I love interacting with people, connecting with people. So yeah.
Well, Ron, thank you so much for joining us. We want to thank our producer, Nathan, and Rich. It was so fun having you here.
Yeah, it was great to be here.
Thank you, Rich.
You spoke to Rich. He was so excited about that picture. I feel like that picture of Daniel, that painting, is going to come out. So it's great.
Oh, I hope so. I love it. Yeah, it hangs on my wall in a very 30 by 40 print in my room. So yeah, it's an inspiration.
Well, thank you so much for joining us in the Understanding Daniel podcast. We hope you have a great day.